Hi, OTA community. I just wanted to welcome back Dr. Morgan Appel for Parent University. So here is Dr. Appel, and he's going to talk to us about core knowledge and how it affects the brain, what the brain of it is. All right, so Dr. Appel, thank you so much.
Okay. Oh, that was a compacted introduction. So Old Town Academy community, welcome and thank you for joining us on rather a brisk, I was going to say Tuesday evening. I'm a day ahead. A brisk Monday evening. We know that it is a sacrifice for you even to spend an hour, to take an hour out of your busy evenings. But I'm overjoyed to see everybody who is here in person and also who is out there in the virtual world. And today we are going to talk about core knowledge and brain compatible learning. My name is Morgan Appel, and I am an assistant dean in the Department of Education and Community Outreach for the Division of Extended Studies at UC San Diego. And it is our pleasure to provide this short workshop on core knowledge and invite you to ask questions and to follow up later if there is anything else we can do for you. And as we talked about in our orientation, our information session, and our introduction, we have a number of recurring themes that are germane to all sessions of Parent University, which are those that are good for heart, good for head, and good for hands. Because you see where these three qualities intersect, you will find high performance. And typically when we talk about schools and we talk about high performance, we talk about grades and test scores, but we're talking about something that is just a little bit different this evening. And through this series, we are talking about interacting with learners in ways that they are happy, that they are productive, they have a sense of well-being and a sense of confidence, because when we put heart, head, and hands together, that is where we will see those qualities and the foundation to build out a lifelong love of learning. So if at any time you are not seeing that connection, it is important that you apprise me so we can steer the ship back into port. Okay, so let us begin at the beginning and talk about the nature of core knowledge. And as we move through each of these sections on core knowledge, what you will see is that they are brain compatible. And once we're done talking about exactly the common characteristics of core knowledge, we're going to delve into the neuroscience of learning and find out why it works so well. But what is core knowledge? Well, it is a curricular and an instructional approach that is solid, one that is lasting. There is unchanging knowledge, such as important events of world history. So what it does is it highlights the things that are most important. It is progressive. It is sequenced. It is a planned progression based on students' previous knowledge and eliminating excessive repetition and gaps. And one of the things that we will find when we look at the way we learn, the neurobiology of teaching and learning, we will find exactly why it is so important to build upon those things that we already know, because we always learn in context. The brain always searches for new information as it is contextualized, and we build on top of it. It's like weaving a blanket or creating a tapestry. Knowledge that is specific, clearly defined knowledge at each grade level that ensures fairness for all students. Because when it comes to brain compatible learning, we know that clarity is king and that ambiguity can produce a sense of anxiety, which leads to really affecting the survival mechanism and putting us into survival mode. And we'll see why that is so important. And it's knowledge that is shared. So all students, regardless of background, have a shared knowledge that they need to be included in our national literate culture. So core knowledge maintains all of these different characteristics. It is predicated on two very important realizations. First, that children can learn at any given moment depends on what they already know. Again, because the brain grabs onto things that it already knows and scaffolds. It builds upon a foundation. And what they know is a function of previous experience in teaching. Expertise and education is what we build upon. Knowledge builds upon knowledge. That is key. The more you know, the more you learn. And this is well established by cognitive science, and that is something that we are going to explore in just a bit. Nearly all of our most important goals for education, greater reading comprehension, the ability to think critically and solve problems, even things like higher test scores, are a function of depth and breadth of our knowledge. So not only are we talking about cognitive progression, we're also talking about socio-emotional connection to curriculum and instruction, and building out vital mentally cognitive skills that are relevant to anything that we would do. Things like creative critical thinking, communication, resilience, the ability to bounce back, the ability to work independently, the ability to work with others, are all enmeshed in core knowledge. Now, when we look at core knowledge as a specific curriculum, what we are looking at is science, mathematics, language arts, classical literature, English, history, and geography, music, and visual arts. So it's a knowledge-based curriculum that emphasizes the importance of learning as a broad contextual body of common knowledge. So it is cross-curricular, and when we look at brain science, we'll see exactly why that is so very important. Now, when you look at core knowledge as an enterprise, it is something that purposefully attends to equity gaps through the delivery of shared knowledge. So we understand that learning is cumulative, that learning is developmental. That's why it takes place over a number of years. But learning gaps are also a result of delivering a curriculum over time. So we realize that, and we look at where the gaps can be filled in. We don't specify everything that needs to be learned, but really offering specific guidelines. So when we look at the delivery of core knowledge, we're talking about 50% of the core, and then 50% that is left to the school to fill in. Now, one of the things that we know through experience and expertise is that learning should be engaging and exciting. And we'll see exactly why when we look at the neuroscience of learning. But we also know that it can prove taxing. It's cumulative, it's developmental, but just as engaging as it is, it can also be taxing. It can be mentally taxing. And we understand that learning should be epiphany-based, that wonderful aha. And anybody who has been at the front of the classroom, whether it's a K-12 classroom or a post-secondary classroom, when you see that your students are finally getting it, that moment of epiphany, that aha moment, is really what we are in it for. And it should be rooted in background knowledge. Now, this is also to say that the brain loves novelty, but we can't have novelty unless we build on background knowledge. Now, if you think of the way that education is conventionally done in the United States, we spend about 50% of our time in silent study. We spend about 50% of our time listening. In other countries, it's a little different. Learning is 80% interactive, and that's what core knowledge approaches. Core knowledge is not just something that's intuitive, but it's actually research-based. It has been undertaken successfully in Europe, in France, Germany, Japan, and Sweden, and really does everything that we hope that teachers would do in terms of attending to the unique learning styles and profiles of individual students. And those of us who have been in the classroom understand that 50% of our work during the school year is the work of the detective, meaning we spend a good deal of time, about half a year, figuring out just what makes our kids tick and what their interests are. Because in as much as we would like to know this coming in, and as much as we have cumulative folders and communications from other teachers, our kids don't come to us with signs around their neck that says, I'm a visual learner, I like this, I like that. We spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. And once we do, we differentiate our instruction, which means we attend to different learning styles and profiles. And really, kids come to us organically differentiated, different in a variety of ways, and we respond to differentiation. So core knowledge really has that as a key. Using common reference points, leveling the playing field is also very important, and that is where we are able to attend to learning lags, and we chip away at the impact of cumulative deficit. In literacy, we call this the Matthew effect, because we know that the learning gaps, especially in reading, tend to be logarithmic versus linear. So the further away you get as you progress, the impact is much larger. So what does this mean in terms of practical neuroscience? We know this is beneficial. We have seen the benefits. The research meets it out. But why? Well, one of the things that we understand is that core knowledge appeals not only to content, but emotion. And as far back as ancient Egypt, we know that they understood that there was a connection between emotion and learning. When they preserved pharaohs through mummification, they threw the brain away because they viewed it as a superfluous organ, because they believed that the heart was the center of all emotion and learning. Now, they understood the connection. They got the neuroscience wrong, but they understood that learning lies at the heart of surviving and thriving as humans. Take it a bit more recently with the original Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci. He says, as every divided kingdom falls, so every mind divided by many studies confounds and saps itself. We know that back in the Renaissance, we didn't really separate areas of the curriculum. We understood them to be integrated and holistic. When we think of Da Vinci, oftentimes we will think of him as an inventor, as an artist, as a philosopher, as somebody who understood the physiology of people. So he really didn't separate all of these things, but instead he understood that everything is related to everything else. And when you try to parse it out, it becomes taxing mentally and also emotionally. He also spoke compellingly to the urgency of doing. So not only learning theory, but engaging in practice, but also understanding that practice without theory is like a ship without a rudder. So all of these things that we talk about that are embedded in core knowledge really go back to the Renaissance and beyond. Now, also very important to understand when we look at the novelty element of core knowledge, we understand that our brains are hardwired to dismiss 99% of new information, and the way that core knowledge sort of hones things down to its essentials makes a lot of sense. So as you see here in this cocktail party, you'll notice that there are a lot of people talking, a lot of things going on, but our brains are trained to really follow only one stream of conversation or be able to do one thing at one time. Multitasking in and of itself is a bit of a myth, because we understand that the brain really absorbs about 1% of what it hears the first time without reinforcement or redundancy, which you can see in a cross-curricular way through core knowledge. And this impact, this effect is called the cocktail party effect. When we think about our brains, we can compare it to an iPhone or a smart device. And it may not look as sleek as the latest offering for Apple or Samsung, but really we are in possession of the smartest of all devices. Can we download music or respond to queries as fast as Alexa? Probably not, but our device is much, much older and much, much more capable. We have a lifetime contract and we update every day. Now, to understand why core knowledge works so well, it's important to understand how the brain works. What you are looking at is sort of a basic roadmap of the brain. And the brain has different parts that do different things. And the rule of thumb is the deeper you go into the structure of the brain, the more primitive the structure. So what you see here is the cerebellum and the brainstem that was present in the great reptiles. And this is where we find things like motor control, sensory pathways, some cognition. This is also where our fight, flight, or freeze response lives. Our survival mechanism lives there. Because if you think about being a great reptile, there's really only a few things you have to worry about. One is who you're going to eat and who's going to eat you. Hence, the survival mechanism lives here. Right on top of the cerebellum and the brainstem, you will see the temporal lobe that deals with auditory processing, speech, vision, and semantics. The occipital lobe, which deals with visual information. But what is so important, and probably one of the two most important lobes of the brain, is the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is where we take in information and we make it whole. So we will take in sensory information from things that we hear, from things that we see, from things that we touch. So, for example, I have this pen here, and I can see it. It has a certain shape. I can touch it. It has a certain feeling. It has a certain sound. It has a certain smell to it, and it has a certain taste to it. But it has not become complete until it goes through the parietal lobe, where I can put all of those things together and I get this as a pen. And this is going to be important as we move forward. But let's put a pin in the pen, as it were, and take a look at the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the most human part of the human brain. This is really our decision-making complex. This is where we control impulses. This is where we have our judgment, language, working memory, motor function, socialization, and spontaneity all live here. Another way to look at the human brain is to look at it in three parts, to look at it as an evolutionary structure. So when we talked about the cerebellum and the brainstem here, we call this area the R complex or the reptilian complex. Some will call it the dinosaur brain. But we saw this structure dating back to about 500 million years. Now, arguably, we call this the lizard brain, the reptile brain, the R complex. But where we first saw this structure was not in the great reptiles, but it was actually in fish. I guess fish are not as menacing, perhaps, as dinosaurs, so we call it the lizard brain. And what's most important to know about this is our autopilot. This is where we don't have to ask Alexa or Siri to remind us to breathe every so often. This is where most of our sensory, all of the things that allow us to sort of move without thinking about it, our autopilot, and then also fight and flight live here. So our survival response. Fight, flight, freeze, things like anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder are all thought to live in this part of the brain. Now, as we advance a bit to about 150 million years ago, we have a structure that's built atop the reptilian brain that we call the mammal brain or the limbic system. This is the part of the brain that produces emotions, that produces memories, that produces habits and attachments. Why do we call it the mammalian brain? Because this is a structure that we see in even the most primitive of mammals. If you look at dogs and if you look at cats and things like that, we know that they have emotions, they have memories, they have attachments, and they have dreams. Now, interestingly, the limbic system grows quite rapidly at 2 points in our life. One is during the time that we are toddlers, and one is at the time that we are teenagers. And you may see that the behaviors elicited during these points in life are very similar, because the part of the brain that produces emotions is growing at a much slower rate than the part of the brain, the neocortex, the prefrontal lobe that controls our executive function, is growing at a much slower rate than is the limbic system. So it is important to know that. And the human brain basically reaches its maximum growth. The brain's always growing, but at maximum growth at around age 28. Now, modern humans, around 200,000 years ago or so, we find the neocortex, what we typically refer to as the gray matter. This is where we have language, abstract thought, imagination, consciousness, reasoning, and rationalizing. So you can imagine that if you have your dog who's sitting on the couch after having whipped it up, and you come in and you say, "What have you done to the couch?" The dog is probably not sitting on the couch thinking, "Oh gosh, I'm really sorry. I know you just bought it, but I didn't know how to change the TV channel. I got anxious, so I took it out on the couch." The dog is actually responding to the way that you are interacting with it. So it lacks these sorts of things: rational thought, all of that reasoning and rationalizing. So this begs the question then, how do we learn? What is the learning process? How does the brain learn? Our brains have over 100 billion nerve endings that process sensory information. And this is a very rudimentary look at how this might look. It happens incredibly quickly, and it is not as well designated as all of this. But when we are engaged in active learning, the learning that excites us, the learning that contains novelty, the learning in which we can do things where we have opportunities for success, you will find that the fibers of the brain actually bridge, and as they grow closer, they create synapses. So again, if we look at this, and I am looking here at the pen, for example, I know my olfactory is activated, auditory is activated, visual is activated, and tactile. So it all comes together for a synaptic response. And this is the creation of neural networks or pathways. This is learning. So if you've ever seen a tennis net, if you've ever seen crochet, that's what it looks like. It looks actually like a net, and information is stored in various parts of the brain. And it's really sort of spread across the surface. There's not really a storage locker where you would say, okay, pen, go up 3 flights of stairs, turn left, and it's the second locker on the left, and that will be pen. It doesn't work that way necessarily. Now, learning involves multiple parts of the brain, multiple modalities, and multiple senses. So when we talk about multiple modalities, we're talking about different ways of learning, whether it's visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. So whether you're a visual learner, or you are a better learner by listening, or if you're a better learner by doing, the more modalities you use, the more likely it is to get through. The more senses that you use, the more likely things are able to get through. New information is stored in different parts of the brain, but loosely connected by neural networks, bridges between different parts of the brain for easy access and easy recall. Now, the brain is network-based, so you can think of it like an internet search. It searches for meaning and context within to help process new information and its significance. So when we were talking about core knowledge, we were talking about having a foundation upon which to build. So I'm going to give you an example of what that means. Now, if this was the only thing that I had in my head, remember the pen that we looked at and I said, oh, it has a certain feel, it has a certain look, has a certain smell, and a certain taste. Now, I'm walking along and I come upon this. Now, my brain will start searching to say, have we ever been around something like this before? Do I have anything that I can relate to it? So I search and search and search, and the brain comes up with this. Are these two things the same? Are they similar? So basically what my brain does is to say, have I seen this before? Where did I see it and was it important? Now, as I evaluate the new information, I'm using the old information to scaffold upon it. So I will be able to say, okay, this is like this, but it's shorter. It might have a different feel. It has a different smell, and certainly it has a different taste. And what I can do is to weave the new knowledge atop the pre-existing knowledge. So when the brain is excited by new information, a number of physiological processes occur. Number one, adrenaline. So every incidence of learning activates the survival mechanism. The brain says, stop, this is important, pay attention. And the rest of our functions begin to slow down. Logical, rational part of the brain begins to shut down, as does digestion. But the idea is that the brain becomes focused as a result of the survival mechanism. And if you remember a time where you either learned something or taught something that really grabbed you, you were emotionally engaged. And that is exactly what we were talking about, being excited by new learning. When we talk about the brain, it is very important to recall that the brain is complex and adaptive. So if the brain is blocked in any way, it will try to find a way around. So when we talk about people who have had brain damage, when we talk about people who have had strokes, it's a lot like being stuck on the freeway. The brain will find a way around. The brain is a social brain, which means we learn from one another and that the search for meaning is innate. It doesn't start when we start in kindergarten, but rather we are born looking for meaning. And the search for meaning occurs through patterning, and emotions are critical to patterning. And what do I mean by patterning? Well, think about it this way. Let's go back to prehistoric times, and we are all standing in front of a hedge, and every time we can see the leaves rustle and we hear a sort of a low roar and an acrid smell in the air. Every time those things happen together, one of our friends gets eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. So we understand meaning through patterning, and patterning is absolutely critical. We always perceive and create parts and wholes. You'll have people who will say that they're detail-oriented or that they're big picture-oriented, and our brains really don't distinguish between the two. We do both, and we do both rather well, but we tend to favor one or the other. Learning involves both focused attention and peripheral attention. So focused attention is, let's say, when you're sitting in a classroom and you're listening, you're taking in information. Peripheral attention is somebody may be walking by the door and say, oh, brain and survival mechanism, that's interesting. Or when you are sitting in a classroom and you're paying attention, but there are side conversations happening, your brain is still picking those up and still registering those, and that is peripheral attention. So the brain is like a super absorbent sponge. So whether it's focused or peripheral, you will take it all in. Learning always involves conscious and unconscious processes. Now, this is to say that sleep is very, very important because that is when the brain is not responding to stimuli all of the time, but rather allows time for the brain to process and to move forward. So when we are awake and we are dealing with the world, we have hundreds and thousands of stimuli that we have to deal with, but sleep is important because that's when things move from short-term to long-term memory, and we sort of make sense of our days. We have at least two ways of organizing memory, and learning is developmental. Again, this speaks to the importance of core learning that happens over time because it has to be developmental because we build on things that we already know. Complex learning is enhanced by challenge and inhibited by threat. Challenge and threat may sound similar, but they're two very different things. The brain is a natural problem solver. The brain's a great warehouse for information, but really its primary purpose is to enhance our survival by taking in information from the environment, solving problems in a dynamic and chaotic surrounding so we can survive and live to see another day. That is challenge, and the brain loves a challenge. Inhibited by threat. Well, what is a threat? A threat is anything really that kicks off the survival mechanism. Things like pop quiz, things like being in a classroom where you feel as though you're falling further behind and there's really no way out. You don't have friends. You may think that the teacher doesn't like you. That kicks in the survival mechanism, and we'll see why that is so very important. Even more significant is that every brain is uniquely organized, and that is really the premise for the idea of differentiated instruction, which is so very critical in core knowledge. So what I hope you should be seeing is that what we talked about at the very beginning about presenting a streamlined and equitable system of curriculum instruction really is very much brain compatible. When we talk about memory, so we talked about what learning is, and we talked about how that works. When we talk about memory, what we're talking about is reactivating existing neural networks. And we talked about coming upon this for the very first time, and then building upon knowledge that we already have. It is called scaffolding, literally, because we are building upon things. Now, we talk about redundancy and reinforcement as being important, but that does not mean it in a superfluous way. When we talk about core knowledge, avoiding repetition, we are not talking about redundancy. We're talking about needless repetition rather than things that reinforce. Now, this is really the key to it all. If you want to understand teaching and learning, if you want to understand how to best support your kids in any endeavor, it's very simple, and it all relates to neurobiology, and it all relates to neurochemistry. We talk about the neurochemistry of persistence and the neurochemistry of avoidance. Now, when we look at learning experience, and most of our lives are characterized by learning experience, when we have positive feelings about a learning experience, so when we are engaged, when we are latched on, when our emotions kick in, and when we understand that there's an opportunity for us to solve a problem and to be successful, our brains reward us. So anything that we do that our brains interpret to enhance our survival, whether it is learning a new subject, whether it is doing well on an exam, finding a new way to work, exercise, all of that produce a wonderful chemical cocktail that include endorphins that produce a sense of euphoria, dopamine that stimulates the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex, remember, is our brain's decision-making center. Oxytocin, which is the neurochemical associated with love, trust, and relationships that give you a very warm feeling, and serotonin, which give you an overall sense of well-being. So if you remember the last time, for example, you did something in which you were successful, you probably remember feeling very good about it. And the idea here is that if your brain is rewarding you with this wonderful neurochemical cocktail, you are likely to go back and keep doing that. So if you are in a classroom and you feel welcome and you feel that the curriculum is engaging, you feel that you're doing well, you feel as though that you have friends and support systems, you are likely to keep going back because you are likely to keep having this wonderful experience with the neurochemistry of persistence. So if you find school to be a supportive place, you're going to go back. And you're likely to take a bit more of an academic risk because you feel confident, you feel competent, and that will encourage you perhaps to do something a little bit different, and push your own boundaries a bit. Conversely, negative feelings about a learning experience kick us into survival mode. They produce adrenaline and cortisol that causes anxiety and stress. And what do I mean? What does that feel like? Well, let's say you're speeding down the freeway and you look down for a second, you look up, and in your windshield, the back of the car in front of you is getting ever larger and larger and larger. You slam on the brakes, everything sort of goes into slow motion. Your vision tends to tunnel a bit. Things either speed up or slow down. And that is these neurochemicals that are flowing through you, adrenaline and cortisol, which causes the brain to focus at the immediate problem. So let's say you slam on the brakes, you nearly avoid hitting the car in front of you. And as the two cars separate and you exchange waves or any other kind of hand gestures, how do you feel in the aftermath? You are likely to feel maybe a bit nauseous. You may feel as though the blood has drained to your feet. You may feel headachy as these neurochemicals course through your body. Now, this is not solely the purview of freeways and cars, but imagine if you are sitting in a classroom and you feel unsupported, you feel perhaps that the teacher doesn't like you, you're falling further and further behind, you feel as though you don't have friendships, you're going to probably get these feelings. And when we talk about the difference between threat and challenge, this is what we're talking about when we feel threatened. This is the neurochemistry of avoidance, which means if you go to a place that makes you feel like this, it is unlikely that you will continue to go. So when we look at things like dropouts or excessive absenteeism, it may be a result of this. So when we talk about teaching and learning, when we talk about connecting to a curriculum, when we talk about manifold and diverse opportunities for success, we're also talking about the neurochemistries of persistence and avoidance. When we talk about equity, when we talk about leveling the playing field, when we talk about accessibility in the context of core knowledge, we're talking about also creating a learning environment that is characterized by the neurochemistry of persistence. And again, this really speaks to sort of the brain compatible nature of the core knowledge curriculum. Now, after understanding that, we can also delve a bit into how memory works. And again, memory is very important because it helps us to scaffold when we talk about a streamlined curriculum with probably the most important dates, the most important events. It is easier to activate memory. So the first type of memory that we have is called sensory memory. This is what is immediately received through the senses, hence the name. Auditory, olfactory, and visual. It's immediate. When I pick up this, for example, it's sending information, sensory information that will filter into my parietal lobe. Now, the way that memory works is really about the brain making a decision using its survival mechanism to say what is important. So, if I judge this information to be important, it may filter into short-term memory. So what is important at the time? Do I need to know the different textures and things of pens? Maybe I do. And if it's that important, then it will filter into short-term memory. And short-term memory is really like a scratch pad for information under process. So as we talk, you need to know the beginning of a sentence to understand the end of a sentence. And really what we're talking about is 30 seconds. Our short-term memory is about 30 seconds. A telephone number, a credit card. And when we work with something called chunking, that helps. So breaking things into smaller, more digestible pieces of information. So if you look at your credit cards, if you look at your social security number, often they will be hyphenated to help us remember. This also helps us, for example, to organize essays into smaller bits, into smaller chunks. Now, if the information is deemed sufficient to go into long-term memory, what we will find is it is really an area for storage with little decay. There are ways to alter long-term memory, but really you can think about memory as a storage unit. And really there's three things you can do with long-term memory. One is you can put stuff in, you can take stuff out, oh, that's pretty difficult to do, and you can bring stuff back. So repeated exposure and rehearsal transfers from short-term memory to long-term memory, encoding on a part of the brain called the hippocampus. So that is why it is so important when we talk about the developmental aspects of core knowledge and building things, revisiting things, especially as you do so across the curriculum. You'll find that it is more likely to transfer from short-term memory to long-term memory. And we know, again, that learning is most effective over time. Learning is developmental because you have to build on knowledge that you already have. So when you have kids who may come from other parts of the world, who may not have the same educational background or be in the same place or even speak the same language, they have to learn things for the first time. And that takes a bit longer than actually building upon something that you already have. You can delete parts of a long-term memory. Sometimes it's a matter of decay. You know, this idea, if you don't use it, you lose it, but that's very rare. Or through interference. And there are professions dedicated to dealing with issues in long-term memory. How do you retrieve? What does retrieval look like when you bring things back to build upon them? Well, there are really two ways of doing it. One is recall, and that is almost a photographic reproduction. So if you have ever had a very happy or a very traumatic event, it is emotionally singed upon your brain. And that's why we say that learning with emotion is the emotion that sticks. So for example, you can think about a wedding day, you can think about a car accident, you can think about those things that have an emotional imprint. And when you close your eyes, you can really recreate it almost in full. You can remember who was there, you can remember things like the temperature of the room, the smells, and aspects of that nature. Oftentimes this will be triggered. So if somebody has been in a terrible auto wreck, the sound of crunching sheet metal, or perhaps the smell of brake fluid, even if it's not happening to that person, it will take them right back to that place. Some people can't, for example, go into hospitals because it's very traumatic. Hearing certain sounds that will take them right back to an incidence of trauma. So recall, vivid reproduction. And then there's recognition. And recognition is really a little bit more opaque. It is, okay, you know, I have seen this before. I know, so if you're watching television, for example, and you see an actor and you can't really remember exactly who the actor is, but you can say, I know that I've seen her before. And where was it? It is a little bit vaguer. And again, when we talk about memory, they're not in a specific location, but spread across the brain's entire surface. So there is a dynamic interplay between learning and memory and instruction that all gets tied back into this idea of the neuroscience of persistence and the neuroscience of avoidance. Now, it's important to start early. And when we talk about core knowledge, we are really talking about beginning early. And all of you are right about here in this range. And what this graphic is showing you is that the brain's ability to change in response to experience tends to be greater. Our level of plasticity, the brain's ability to form connections in response to learning or injury is greatest here. So at this point in our lives, our brains are more able to change, and the amount of effort that the change requires is relatively low. So we're not necessarily just talking about absorbing content, but we're also talking about those sound habits of mind that are embedded in core knowledge, the things like creative and critical thinking, communication, good work habits, being resilient, and really connecting with a curriculum. And you'll see that our brains are plastic through our lifespan, but tend to be less so as we age. So this saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, is not necessarily the case, but certainly it is going to take a lot longer, and it's going to be very frustrating for both you and the dog. And if you remember, when we talked about the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain, growing very rapidly, we're talking really about here, and we're talking really about here, and then things tend to stabilize as the brain reaches its sort of maximum growth at about age 28. And what you'll see at that point of equilibrium, now it becomes much harder to learn, much harder to unwind habits and processes that you've used, and less able to change in response to experiences. So when we talk about starting early, that's why younger kids are much more able to learn a second language, because this is all in the stage of development. When we get to adolescence, when we talk about up to late 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, middle school years, what you will find is that the reward systems, our risk-taking systems, and our emotional systems are growing at a much faster rate than are the inhibitory systems, sort of the making good decisions. Now, when you are in the terrible twos, at least you look up to your parents as guides and as those to support you. When you are in your terrible teens, that is not necessarily the case, because usually you're looking for approval from peers versus approval from traditional authority figures. Now, when we talk about any curriculum, but when we talk about the core curriculum, the core knowledge curriculum specifically, a lot of times we are talking about motivation. We are born with motivation because motivation is critical to survival. And when we talk about kids, when we're talking about younger kids, we are really talking about a boundless level of energy. And we know that motivation, whether it's for those things that enhance our survival, things like eating, things like reproduction, all of this must be pleasurable to do in and of themselves. That's why you want to connect to a curriculum that is meaningful. When we talk about young kids, we're talking about things like manipulation, locomotion, language, and social interaction, all very important. But the most important thing that spurs cognitive growth, that serves as a connector to the curriculum and a lifelong love of learning, is the immediate satisfaction that comes with being good at something. And when we talk about being good at something and the satisfaction that goes with it, really what we are talking about is this: multiple opportunities for success, whether they are bite-sized or a much larger mouthful. Now, when you look at the core knowledge curriculum that we talked about earlier, it also includes those things that enhance motivation, habituation, and novelty. So when we talk about habituation, we talk about those things that come automatically, that knowledge that automatically surfaces. And because core knowledge is a streamlined, pared down part of a larger curriculum, it is easier to do that. And kids and educators can find novelty. They can bring personalized touches into it. Confidence, very important. Play is also something that is essential as it gives the brain free rein a bit. but feeling as though they are also part of a community. So when we are working on something together, when we are working on something that everyone, in which everyone can participate, it forms a learning community. And really, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to a place called flow. And flow is really an intensive state where somebody becomes completely immersed in experience. Some people will call it in the zone, being in the groove, but really to the point where you are so focused, you're unaware of distractions, even bodily needs. We know it's a universal and cross-cultural experience. So think of social media, think of binge watching, think of books that you can't put down where you are completely lost in an experience. And when we get to that point, we're really creating a balance between ability, level of difficulty, and the challenge. So things can't be too easy or too difficult. We're talking about clear goals and expectations, all inherent to a core knowledge curriculum. High degree of concentration in a limited field of attention and an opportunity to become deeply engaged. When we talk about cutting away things that are superfluous, it allows for that. And what you find is that there is a real loss of self-consciousness, sort of unaware of what you're doing. You're sort of on autopilot. You are just really so immersed that you don't even really get a feeling for the passage of time. So sometimes it feels like things will pass very quickly. So, when we talk about things being, so enjoyable that the day seems to move quickly, or we're talking about things moving slowly. So there's that time distortion. And when you're in this state, what you'll see, it's really a matter of skill and challenge. And these are elements that are presented within a core knowledge curriculum where you can really find a slim gap between the level of skill and the level of challenge. That is the same sort of thing when we look at binge watching and when we look at video games. We see that the brain is seeking out multiple sources of information to engage in problem-solving activity. And when we are in this flow channel, that is where you're going to find motivation, that is where you're going to find persistence, and that is where you're going to find creativity. It's where cognitive meets affective. So that is emotion and cognition coming together. And you'll see that it's a channel, and sometimes you'll fall out of the channel. So let's think of our learners. For example, if you have kids who have a low level of skill in a particular area, but there's a low level of challenge, what you will find is that kids are either apathetic or they're bored. As the level of challenge goes up and the level of skill remains the same, you'll find worry, anxiety, and then you will move into flow through arousal. So the idea behind getting everybody in a level, sort of a level playing field, is really to get everybody in this channel. Now, if the level of skill is high and the level of challenge is low, you'll feel relaxed. You don't care. Here you'll say, hey, I'm not very good at this, but I don't have to be. Here, it's like, I'm good at this, and I really don't have to put in a lot of effort. And the idea is to really to get everybody into this state. But what we want to be able to do is provide experiences at schools where their level of motivation is innate, where it comes from within. And ideally, students want to be appreciated. They want to feel a sense of confidence. They want to be good at things. They want to feel that they have a sense of peace of mind and success as they move through school, career, and life. But really, beyond curriculum, beyond established practice, it's the level of support that we can offer as not only as educators, but also as parents to help make things through. So I know we have about 5 minutes until the end of the session. Wanted to see if there are any questions, if there's anybody out on YouTube.
They will come in that way.
Okay,
But if we get questions, I'll make sure to get them to you.
that would be absolutely fantastic. So my contact information is here. If there's anything that you need, please do feel free to email me at any time. And certainly, thank you to Mr. Phillips and the assembled body here at Old Town Academy, and then to all of you out there in the audience. Thank you for your time. It's much appreciated, and we will